Hi, this is Tammy Horlocker with the Center for Strength. I am the activities coordinator at the Center for Strength. We are a federally and state grant funded resiliency center that was set up in the aftermath of the shooting at STEM School Highlands Ranch on May 7th, 2019. These Lunch and Learn series, even though this is not lunch, it's dinner. These Lunch and Learn series that we're doing at the center now is our way of doing psychoeducation and bringing that information in bite-sized consumable pieces. So it's easier for us and our audience to manage. So when we're done with this tonight, this recording will live on our YouTube channel. I will stop the recording before we get to questions, just to kind of protect everybody's privacy. So Jenny, and I should have asked you this, Jenny, I know Jenny's been with the center for at least 17 months because that's how long I've been with the center, almost 2 years, but you started a little sooner, right, Jenny?
It was definitely in the throes of COVID because we were only meeting outside for hikes. It was 2020, maybe about fall of 2020.
Okay. So Jenny, first of all, if you haven't met her in person, she's fantastic. She has this gentle presence that comes across on the screen and in person. She's worked with clients with substance abuse issues, trauma, PTSD, childhood sexual abuse, profound loss, and she has training in traumatic bereavement. Jenny's done a lot of work in the grief area. And I don't know if you would want to be referred to as this, but I do call you our grief expert. So hope that's okay with you. But Jenny, thank you for being here tonight and presenting.
Thank you, Tammy, for that introduction. I'm so glad to be here talking about a topic that I'm very passionate about. I think I would call myself someone who specializes in grief versus like a grief expert, because I think I'll be learning about grief and how to carry my own and how to walk with people through theirs, probably forever. And thank you so much. So I think most of you know me, some of you may not. Yes, I've done workshops, individual therapy, and if you haven't before, you'll see me around the center. And the topic I'll be talking about tonight is anticipatory grief. And in the sense that we're talking about it, it's anticipating a hard time of year, a hard date. Sometimes the term has been referred to when we're maybe grieving a death that hasn't happened yet. So maybe that's how you've heard the term before. But for tonight's purposes, we'll be talking about that anticipation and time leading up to a really hard time of year. And here we are, it's April 18th, and in our community, we have a hard time of year this time of year. We feel the significance of May 7th. How can we best cope with this? And like Tammy said, since we only have half an hour together, we'll leave the last 10 minutes for questions and comments, and I'll lead us through the rest here. I like to start with an opening ritual, and that's because ritual can be so healing in trauma healing and grief healing, in just about anything. And so when I start with a ritual and end with a little ritual, it just shows how simple yet profound healing ritual can be. We can drop into our feelings. It signifies kind of a different space that we're entering into. Sometimes it's somatic. If I were to light a candle, we can see the flame, we can kind of feel the flame, we can smell the scent. So engaging our senses is also healing for emotional trauma, for grief. So what I'll do for our opening ritual is read a short passage. And this is written by one of my favorite mentors in traumatic bereavement. Her name is Joanne Cacciatore, and these are her words. It's typically American to equate healing with doing something. When we have a problem, we fix it, and we prefer to do it quickly. But fixing is not the same as healing. In fact, it can easily get in the way of healing. Fixing is something mechanical, scientific, economic, military. Healing is something human, emotional, spiritual. As a psychologist and a psychotherapist, as a patient and a person, I have learned that before you can fix a problem, you first have to feel the problem. Healing happens not through doing, but through feeling. And I think that sets the tone beautifully for what we're about to talk about. I want to start with change. Change is a precursor to grief. And that's because when something changes, something has been lost. They're two sides of the same coin. Even with good change, there's loss. In my grief therapy class, in my graduate counseling program, our instructor had us create a change line. And this was a long sheet of paper, and we had the dates from when we were born to present day, like task marks along this line. And we were to write down any changes that we experienced through our lives, marriage, divorce. Actually, she had us hold off on death losses, marriage, divorce, moving, a friend moving away, those kinds of things. And then once we noted all the changes we experienced in life, she had us cross off the word change and put the word loss. That was our loss line, all those changes in our lives. So just reflect for a moment, and we're not going to share or comment until the last 10 minutes, but just reflect to yourself, what significant changes have you experienced, perhaps because of May 7th? And now I want to highlight loss. Changes, loss, like I said, it can be physical, like a death. It can be social, like a divorce. It can be any change. There are an infinite number of losses. Better job might include loss of former coworkers, loss of routine or your comfort zone. So now think about what significant losses you've felt since May 7th. And I want to move along now to grief. What is grief? First of all, grief is not a disorder. Grief is not shameful. It's not any of the things that our culture might lead us to believe it is. Grief is a normal process of reacting to a loss, or as we know now, of reacting to change. It's distress that happens when our existing presumptive world has been changed or shattered or lost. Maybe there's a life-changing event. There sure was on May 7th, 2019. And it can include a loss of how we defined ourselves, a loss of ourselves. Overarching losses definitely include a loss of part of ourselves and a part of ourselves in the world that made us feel secure. Reflect for a moment briefly on your experiences of grief since May 7th. And then next in our progression is mourning. How is it different than grieving? Grieving is the feelings, the whole myriad of feelings, the tangle of different feelings. Mourning is that outward expression of feelings, maybe some ritual, maybe some ceremony, maybe some art. It's the outward expression of your grief feeling. By the way, any grieving that we do, that we allow ourselves to do, any mourning that we allow ourselves to do is healing. That is the healing. Not the keeping inside, not the trying to stuff down. The feeling, the grieving, the mourning, that is the healing. That is our healing work. And I want to briefly talk about a couple other kinds of loss and grief that do tie in to our experiences of anticipatory grief. This one's really important. A living loss. So a living loss is a loss that remains over a good part of our lives, or maybe our entire lives. It's an ongoing presence in our life. It's something that we learn how to live with or to carry. It's something we can't necessarily fix, thinking about that opening reading. The ongoing nature of the loss, this is also an important part, it requires continual adjustment. If there's any constant about grief, it's that it's always changing. I know that my significant loss 10 and a half years ago, almost 11 years ago now, sure looks different today than it did after 1 year, 2 years, or 5 years. It's continually changing. Another kind of loss that's important and ties in is a secondary loss. A secondary loss happens when a primary loss impacts so many areas of our life. So there's multiple losses, not just one day. There's lots of losses. And I think about our symbol of the sun, the symbol of STEM Center for Strength, and the different rays that come out. And maybe those rays can be symbolic of secondary losses. So it's easy to think of grief or loss as a one-time occurrence, but it's really the pain of other losses that we feel as a result. So again, let's reflect on any secondary losses from May 7th that we may be experiencing. And another kind of loss that's a little harder to explain is ambiguous loss. So this is a non-death loss. It's difficult to name. It's difficult to describe what's been lost. You might feel unclear or uncertain on what even has been lost. Yes, we grieve and we mourn Kendrick. And there are lots of losses associated with May 7th. And some of those are kind of unclear. Some of those are ambiguous. Maybe we grieve how a person close to us may be physically present with us in the room, but maybe they're mentally absent. Maybe they're going through emotional unavailability because of mental health problems or an addiction. So let's reflect for a moment on our ambiguous losses. What's hard to name? What's a little unclear or uncertain that we're experiencing? And that brings us to anticipatory grief. Like I said, sometimes it's defined as maybe you have a grandparent with dementia or Alzheimer's, and you think, someday grandma's going to die. That's really sad. And you experience some grief feelings before the death. But for our purposes today, we're looking at it as when a difficult date rolls around that calendar or a difficult time of year. In our case, the anniversary of May 7th, this is the 4th year since May 7th, 2019. For some of us, that lead up is really profound. It's nearly unbearable. It's filled with stress and trauma. Sometimes it comes out sideways where we're not even sure what's wrong. And then we think, oh, it's that time of year. For other people, they don't even realize maybe that the date is approaching, that the time is approaching. Maybe it catches them off guard. Some people describe it as a slow march towards something terrible, a dreadful, harbinger or hearkening of something to come. And some people remember what they were doing the month before, the weeks before, the weekend before, the day before, the morning of. I know that certainly with my profound loss, those things were very salient as that date approached. So painful. And just know, wherever you fall on that continuum, It's all okay. This is what our brains and our bodies and our minds do after something traumatic happens. Just because I feel that march and I know what's happening and what happened years ago, it doesn't mean I'm morbid. It doesn't mean I'm stuck. It doesn't mean I'm anything other than a human reacting in the way that humans react after a trauma. So, what can we do? And I'm going to go through these fast because already I only have 3 minutes. Self-compassion first, please. But first, self-compassion. Let that be your mantra. We flourish in we flourish when our foundation is one of self-compassion, not one of self-criticism or judgment. I hope that hearing about these different kinds of grief, hearing about this is what our brains and bodies do after a trauma can help you have self-compassion first when you have any reactions this time of year. And grief demands one thing. Okay? One thing. It's not rocket science. Even anticipatory grief, even the other types of griefs I mentioned. One thing. To be attended to. How can we attend? How can we practice grieving? How can we practice mourning, ritual, ceremony, giving space to our feelings? And like I said, maybe I didn't say this when I was talking about ritual. We can have private micro rituals that only we know about. There's a special necklace I wear. I don't have it on today. That's for me. That's my ritual when I put it on each, not every day, but when I put it on. It doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be big. They can be small ways. So some tangible tips real quick. It's helpful to have a plan and to give yourself grace if your plan changes. And it's helpful. Sometimes people have learned over the years, I'm going to take the day off. That's a hard day for me, and I'm going to take it off. That is something I allow myself every year. It can be helpful to carve out intentional time around that significant date, around that time of year. That could look like getting out your journal, setting the timer, lighting that candle, intentional, maybe even scheduled time for your anticipatory grief that really does release the pressure valve. Also, keep in mind that often the lead up can be worse than the actual day itself. Let that give you a little bit of peace. And I really want to recommend that you watch the Recovery Over Time replay. That was an event that the center hosted last year. It was lots of people who survived mass violence speaking about what their recovery has looked like. And I think everyone can benefit from watching this when and if you're ready. And I'm going to wrap up. I have lots more things to talk about, but I'm going to wrap up my piece and let us get to our discussion piece. Any questions, comments, anything that you'd like to share?